The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cluttered attic of the Whitmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina. Dr. Sarah Mitchell wiped the dust from her forehead, leaving a gray smear across her tanned skin. As a historical preservation specialist from the University of North Carolina, she had spent 3 weeks cataloging the contents of this forgotten mansion, scheduled for demolition in just 2 months. The estate, built in 1869, had stood empty for nearly 40 years after the last descendant died without heirs. "Sarah, you need to see this," called Marcus Chen, her graduate assistant, from behind a tower of deteriorating cardboard boxes. His voice carried an unusual urgency that made Sarah immediately set down the leather-bound journal she had been examining. She navigated through the maze of forgotten furniture and moth-eaten curtains until she reached the far corner of the attic where Marcus stood, holding a large frame wrapped in yellowed cloth. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully peeled back the fabric, revealing an oil portrait that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The painting depicted 3 young women, clearly sisters, seated in what appeared to be a formal parlor. The oldest, perhaps 25, sat in the center with an expression of serene authority. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, accentuating high cheekbones and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to follow the viewer. On her left sat a girl of maybe 18, with softer features and a hint of melancholy in her gaze. The youngest, no more than 16, perched on the right with her hands folded primly in her lap, but there was something defiant in the set of her jaw. What made the portrait extraordinary was not just the technical skill of the artist, but an unsettling quality in the composition. The sisters wore matching dark dresses with high collars, typical of the 1870s, but their expressions held a discordant note. While their postures suggested propriety and refinement, their eyes betrayed something else entirely, a shared knowledge, perhaps, or a carefully guarded secret. "Check the back," Marcus said, turning the frame carefully. Affixed to the wooden backing was a small brass plate, tarnished with age but still legible. Sarah pulled out her phone to illuminate the inscription. "The Callahan Sisters. Clara, Edith, and Margaret. Painted by Thomas Rutherford, October 1873, Asheville, North Carolina." Sarah photographed the plate, her mind already racing through the historical records she had been compiling. "Callahan. I've seen that name in the estate documents. I think they were the original owners of this property." "There's more," Marcus said, pointing to a small detail in the lower right corner of the painting that Sarah had initially missed. Partially obscured by the youngest sister's dress was what appeared to be a door handle, suggesting the presence of a cellar or basement entrance directly beneath where the sisters sat. Sarah leaned closer, studying the brushstrokes. It was subtle, almost deliberately hidden, but unmistakable once you noticed it. Why would the artist include that detail? It seems oddly specific. Marcus pulled out his tablet and began searching through the digitized floor plans they had obtained from the County Historical Society. According to these architectural drawings from 1869, there's no basement indicated in the original construction. The house was built directly on a stone foundation, typical for this area and era. "Then what's that door handle doing in the portrait?" Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Marcus. She took several high-resolution photographs of the painting from various angles, making sure to capture every detail. The discovery energized them both. For the next 2 hours, they carefully transported the portrait downstairs to the main floor, setting it up in what had once been the drawing room. The afternoon light through the tall windows illuminated the painting with an almost eerie clarity, making the sisters' expressions even more haunting. Sarah stood back, crossing her arms as she studied the portrait. "We need to find out more about these women. Check death records, census data, newspaper archives, anything you can find about the Callahan sisters between 1870 and 1900. Marcus was already typing on his laptop. "On it. But Sarah, if there really is something beneath that room in the portrait, shouldn't we try to locate it in the actual house?" Sarah considered this carefully. Their mandate was to document and preserve historical artifacts before demolition, not to conduct archaeological excavations. But the mystery of the portrait had already taken hold of her professional curiosity. "Let's see what we can find in the records first. Then we'll decide our next steps." That evening, Sarah worked late in the makeshift office they had set up in the mansion's former library. The room smelled of old leather and dust, with towering shelves still containing hundreds of volumes dating back to the 19th century. She had sent Marcus home hours ago, but sleep seemed impossible with the portrait now leaning against the wall across from her desk, the sister's eyes watching her every movement. She pulled up census records from 1870 on her laptop. There they were: Clara Callahan, age 23, listed as head of household. Edith Callahan, age 16. Margaret Callahan, age 14. No parents listed, no other family members. The occupation field for Clara read proprietress, but there was no indication of what kind of business she operated. The 1880 census told a different story. Only Clara remained at the address, now listed as age 33, still unmarried, occupation unchanged. There was no record of Edith or Margaret. Sarah checked death records for the decade but found nothing under those names in Asheville or surrounding counties. She rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her cooling coffee. The disappearance of 2 young women from census records didn't necessarily mean anything sinister. They could have married and moved away, taken different names, or simply been missed by census takers. But the complete absence of any documentation felt deliberate. A soft creaking sound made Sarah look up sharply. The old house settled and groaned constantly, but this sound came from directly overhead, measured, rhythmic footsteps. She reminded herself that Marcus had left hours ago and she was alone. Old houses make noise, she told herself firmly. The wood contracts as temperatures drop. Perfectly natural. But the footsteps continued, pacing back and forth across the ceiling above her. Sarah closed her laptop and stood, her heart beginning to pound. She was a scientist, rational and methodical, but the portrait of the 3 sisters seemed to watch her with knowing eyes as she walked to the doorway and looked up at the dark staircase leading to the 2nd floor. The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, Sarah heard only her own breathing and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. She forced a laugh at her own nervousness, but it sounded hollow in the empty house. "Just the house settling," she said aloud, her voice echoing slightly. She returned to her desk, determined to focus on research rather than imagination. But as she reopened her laptop, she noticed something odd about the portrait in her peripheral vision. She turned to face it directly, studying the image in the lamplight. The detail of the door handle seemed more prominent now, as if the shadows in the painting had shifted to emphasize it. Sarah shook her head, attributing the change to fatigue and the late hour. But when she stood and approached the portrait for a closer examination, she noticed something else she had missed before. In the background of the painting, barely visible in the darkened corner of the room, was what appeared to be a figure, just the suggestion of a person, painted in shades so dark they nearly disappeared into the shadows. Sarah pulled out her phone again, using its flashlight to illuminate the area. Yes, there was definitely something there. A 4th person, perhaps, or just an artifact of the artist's technique. She photographed this detail as well, making a mental note to have the portrait professionally analyzed. The more she looked at this painting, the more she realized it was not the simple family portrait it first appeared to be. Every element seemed carefully chosen to convey information, but what information and why? Sarah packed up her materials around midnight, unable to shake the feeling that the portrait was trying to tell her something important. As she locked the front door of the mansion and walked to her car, she looked back at the darkened windows of the 2nd floor. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a pale face looking down at her, but when she blinked, there was nothing but glass reflecting the streetlights. She drove back to her apartment in downtown Asheville, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, diving deeper into the historical records of Asheville in the 1870s. The post-Civil War period had been turbulent for North Carolina, with economic hardship, social upheaval, and a general breakdown of the old plantation system. Many families had lost everything. Others had adapted and found new ways to survive. The Callahan name appeared sporadically in various documents. A property deed from 1868 showed that Clara Callahan had purchased the land and commissioned the construction of the mansion, an unusual transaction for an unmarried woman of that era. The amount she paid suggested considerable wealth, but there was no record of where that money came from. Her father was listed as deceased in 1867. Her mother had died giving birth to Margaret in 1857. Sarah found a brief mention in an 1874 edition of the Asheville Gazette, a small notice announcing that Miss Clara Callahan would be hosting a private gathering at her residence for select ladies of refinement. No other details were provided, but the phrasing struck Sarah as oddly formal and secretive. Another article from 1876 was more intriguing. A scandal had erupted when a prominent businessman's wife disappeared, last seen visiting the Callahan residence. The woman was eventually found a week later in Tennessee, claiming she had left her abusive husband to start a new life. The article noted that this was the third instance of married women disappearing after visiting the Callahan home, though all had eventually resurfaced in other states, safe and apparently by their own choice. Sarah sat back, beginning to form a hypothesis. Could the Callahan sisters have been running some kind of underground railroad for abused women? It would explain the secrecy, the wealth that Clara somehow possessed, and the careful way they seemed to operate outside the boundaries of respectable society while maintaining a veneer of propriety. But it didn't explain the cellar door in the portrait, the disappearance of the two younger sisters from census records, or the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to permeate every aspect of this mystery. She finally fell asleep just before dawn, her dreams filled with images of three young women watching her from the shadows, their expressions impossible to read. Sarah returned to the Whitmore estate the next morning with renewed determination and 2 large coffees, one for herself and one for Marcus, who arrived shortly after she did. The October sun struggled to penetrate the thick clouds gathering over the mountains, casting the mansion in a gray, subdued light that seemed appropriate for the investigation ahead. "I found something interesting," Marcus said before she could even greet him properly. He pulled out his tablet, showing her a scan of a handwritten ledger. This was in the county clerk's records. It's a property tax assessment from 1877. Look at the notation. Sarah squinted at the faded handwriting. The document listed the Callahan property with standard details about square footage and assessed value, but in the margin, someone had written in pencil, "Structure includes undisclosed subterranean storage. Assessment incomplete pending inspection." "Was there ever a follow-up inspection?" Sarah asked. Marcus shook his head. "Not that I could find. And here's the thing. I cross-referenced this with other properties in the area from the same time period. None of them have similar notations. Whatever was under the Callahan house, it was unusual enough that the tax assessor felt compelled to note it, but apparently never followed up on it." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We need to locate that room from the portrait. The one where the sisters were sitting." They spent the next hour comparing the portrait to the existing layout of the house. The wallpaper in the painting, a distinctive pattern of dark green vines against cream, no longer existed anywhere in the mansion, presumably replaced over the decades. But the room's proportions, the placement of the windows, and the orientation of the floorboards eventually led them to a small parlor on the ground floor that had been converted into a storage room sometime in the mid-20th century. The space was cluttered with old furniture, rolled-up carpets, and stacks of boxes containing everything from Christmas decorations to children's toys. Sarah and Marcus spent 2 hours clearing it out, carrying items into the hallway until the room was empty except for dust and a few stubborn cobwebs. The floorboards were original, wide planks of oak that had darkened with age. Sarah knelt down, running her hands across the wood, feeling for any irregularities. The portrait had shown the door handle in a specific location relative to where the youngest sister sat. If they had identified the room correctly, it should be approximately here. Her fingers found it, a small indentation in one of the boards, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. She motioned Marcus over. "Get me a flashlight and something thin and flat, like a putty knife." Marcus returned with both, plus a hammer and a crowbar. "Just in case," he explained. Sarah carefully inserted the putty knife into the gap between floorboards, working it around the perimeter of what she was now certain was a trapdoor. The wood resisted at first, swollen with over a century of humidity, but gradually began to give way. When she had loosened all 4 sides, she and Marcus used their fingers to grip the edge and pull. The trapdoor lifted with a groan of protesting wood, revealing a dark opening and a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. The smell that emerged was musty and earth, with underlying notes of decay that made Sarah's stomach clench. She shone her flashlight down into the opening, illuminating rough stone walls and what appeared to be a small chamber below. "We should call someone," Marcus said, his voice uncertain. "Maybe the police, or at least the property owner." Sarah knew he was right, but the historian in her rebelled at the idea of letting anyone else make the first examination of what might be a significant historical discovery. "Let's just take a quick look. Document what's down there. Then we'll make the appropriate calls." Marcus nodded reluctantly, and they both switched on their phone flashlights as backup before Sarah carefully descended the stone steps. They were steep and narrow, clearly not designed for frequent use. The air grew cooler as they went down, and Sarah counted 13 steps before her feet touched packed earth. The cellar was larger than she had expected, perhaps 15 feet square, with a ceiling just tall enough for her to stand upright. The walls were stone, mortared with what appeared to be lime and clay. Wooden shelves lined two of the walls, mostly empty now but with remnants of glass jars and ceramic containers. In one corner sat a small cast iron stove, its pipe disappearing up through the ceiling. Someone had lived down here, or at least spent considerable time in this space. But it was what occupied the center of the room that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. A large wooden table, sturdy and well-made, dominated the space. On its surface lay several leather-bound journals, their covers mildewed but intact. Beside them was a wooden box, intricately carved with what appeared to be feminine symbols, flowers, vines, and abstract patterns. And scattered around these items were dozens of photographs, the old tintype kind from the 19th century, showing women of various ages, most of them alone, some in pairs. Sarah approached the table slowly, aware that she might be disturbing a crime scene, a historical site, or both. She used her phone to photograph everything before touching anything, documenting the exact position of each item. Then, carefully, she opened the first journal. The handwriting was elegant, practiced, unmistakably feminine. The first entry was dated March 15, 1870. "The house is finally complete. It took every penny we saved, every sacrifice we made, but it is ours. Clara says we must be careful, that the town is not ready to understand what we intend to do here. But I believe, as she does, that desperate women need a place of sanctuary. Father's death freed us, but so many others remain trapped. This house will be their door to freedom." The entry was signed simply E. Edith, Sarah assumed. She flipped through more pages, reading fragments of entries that painted a picture of three sisters running an elaborate operation to help abused and desperate women escape their circumstances. They provided temporary shelter, forged documents, arranged transportation to other states where the women could start fresh with new identities. It was dangerous, illegal work, but the sisters seemed driven by a fierce commitment to their cause. Marcus had found another journal and was reading aloud, "Clara received a threat today. A man came to the door demanding to know where his wife had gone. She told him nothing, of course, and he left cursing us all. But he knows or suspects. We must be more careful. The consequences if we are discovered would be severe, not just for us but for all the women we have helped." Sarah picked up one of the tintypes. It showed a young woman with bruises visible on her face, staring directly at the camera with an expression of both defiance and terror. On the back, written in faded ink, "Catherine Morrison. Arrived June 1873. Departed July 1873 for St. Louis under the name Catherine Webb. Husband believes her dead." They were documenting everyone they helped, Sarah said quietly, creating a record in case something happened to them. Marcus had opened the carved wooden box. Inside were stacks of currency, old bills, some Confederate, some Union, totaling what must have been thousands of dollars even by 19th century standards. Beneath the money were several pieces of jewelry, likely items left behind or donated by the women the sisters had helped. But it was what lay at the very bottom of the box that changed everything. Marcus pulled out a small velvet bag and opened it, pouring its contents into his palm. Sarah leaned closer to see. They were teeth. Human teeth. At least a dozen of them, some with gold fillings, arranged carefully in the bag as if they were precious gems. "Oh God," Marcus whispered, his face going pale. Sarah's mind raced through possible explanations, each more disturbing than the last. In the 19th century, human teeth were valuable. They could be used for dentures, sold to dentists, or ground up for various medical purposes. But why would the Callahan sisters have a collection of them hidden in their secret cellar? She picked up another journal, this one bound in black leather and significantly newer looking than the others. The first entry was dated January 3, 1874. It happened again. We had no choice. He followed her here, broke down the door in the middle of the night, armed and dangerous. Clara tried to reason with him, but he was beyond reason, consumed by rage and liquor. When he struck Margaret, when I saw the blood on my baby sister's face, something inside me broke. The knife was in my hand before I even thought. The shock in his eyes as he fell. The terrible silence that followed. Sarah felt her hands trembling as she continued reading. Clara says we must be practical. We cannot go to the authorities. They would never believe it was self-defense, not 3 unmarried women against a respected businessman. The scandal would destroy everything we have built, endanger all the women depending on us. So we did what had to be done. The cellar floor is earth. The mountains keep their secrets well. And life, somehow, must go on. Sarah, Marcus said, his voice tight with tension, there's something else. He was pointing to the far corner of the cellar, where the shadows were deepest. Sarah directed her flashlight beam to where he indicated. The packed earth floor showed clear signs of having been disturbed repeatedly, several rectangular depressions, roughly the size and shape of human graves. Sarah's professional training warred with her growing horror. This was not just a historical site, it was potentially a crime scene, albeit one nearly 150 years old. The sisters had not simply been running an underground railroad for abused women. They had been killing the men who came looking for those women, burying them in this secret cellar beneath their respectable home. "We need to call the police," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is beyond our scope now." Marcus nodded, already pulling out his phone, but there was no signal in the cellar. They would have to go back upstairs. Sarah took one last look around the hidden room, trying to memorize every detail, knowing that once authorities were involved, her access to this discovery would be limited. As they climbed back up the stone steps, Sarah's mind was already working through the implications. The portrait took on new meaning now. 3 women guarding a terrible secret, the door to the cellar deliberately included as if the artist knew what lay beneath. Had Thomas Rutherford, the painter, been complicit in their activities? Or had he discovered their secret and commemorated it in this subtle way? They emerged into the daylight of the parlor, and Sarah carefully closed the trapdoor. Looking down at the floorboards, knowing what lay beneath them, she understood why the portrait had always felt unsettling. Those 3 young women had been killers, justified or not, living with the weight of multiple deaths beneath their very feet. Marcus made the call to the Asheville Police Department from the front porch, where he finally got a signal. While they waited for officers to arrive, Sarah returned to the cellar one more time, unable to resist. She needed to understand these women, their choices, their motivations. She opened another journal, this one Margaret's, the youngest sister. The entries were more emotional, less controlled than Edith's careful documentation or the practical tone of Clara's notes. "I cannot sleep. I hear his voice in every creak of the house, feel his hands around my throat in every shadow. Clara says the nightmares will fade, that we did what was necessary, that we saved not just ourselves but all the future women who will find refuge here. But I am only 16, and I have helped bury 3 men in the earth beneath our home. What does that make us? Heroes or monsters? I no longer know." Sarah heard voices upstairs. The police had arrived faster than she expected. She quickly photographed the page, then several more, trying to capture as much as possible before they took everything as evidence. The human story here was more complex than simple murder or simple justice. These women had operated in a world where the law offered them no protection, where abused women had no legal recourse, where property rights and masculine authority trumped all other considerations. "Dr. Mitchell?" A voice called down into the cellar. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come up here now." Sarah took one last look around the hidden chamber that had kept its secrets for nearly a century and a half. Then she climbed the stone steps back into the light, knowing that everything she had discovered would now be examined, analyzed, and judged by modern standards that could never fully understand the desperate circumstances that had created this hidden tomb. Detective James Holloway was a 20-year veteran of the Asheville Police Department, but he had never encountered anything quite like this. He stood in the cleared parlor of the Whitmore estate, looking down at the open trapdoor, and tried to process what Dr. Mitchell had just told him. "You're telling me that 3 sisters in the 1870s were running an underground railroad for abused women, and when the husbands came looking, they killed them and buried them in the cellar?" He kept his voice neutral, professional, but the story sounded like something from a Gothic novel. "That's what the journals indicate," Sarah replied, handing him copies of the photographs she had taken. "I've only read portions of them, but the pattern is clear. They helped women escape abusive situations, provided them with new identities, and when the abusers came looking, they defended themselves and their refuge." Detective Holloway flipped through the images on Sarah's phone, his expression growing more serious. "This is going to be complicated. Technically, murder has no statute of limitations, but everyone involved is long dead. Still, if there are bodies down there..." He gestured to the cellar opening, where his partner, Officer Lisa Valdez, was carefully descending with proper lighting equipment. "Detective," Officer Valdez called up. "You need to see this." Holloway descended into the cellar, followed by Sarah and Marcus, despite the detective's initial protest. What they found was both more and less than they had expected. Officer Valdez had used a portable ground-penetrating radar unit to scan the disturbed areas of the earthen floor. 4 distinct anomalies, she reported, pointing to her equipment's display. All consistent with buried human remains. But there's something else. She directed her flashlight to a section of the wall that had been hidden behind one of the old shelves. "These stones are different, newer mortar, different construction technique. This section was added later, probably to seal something off." Detective Holloway ran his hand over the newer stones. "Can we remove this without damaging potential evidence?" Officer Valdez nodded. "It'll take time, but yes. I'll call in the forensic team." As the police began the careful process of documenting and excavating the cellar, Sarah and Marcus were asked to wait upstairs. More officers arrived, along with forensic specialists from the county and eventually a representative from the State Historic Preservation Office, who looked both excited and horrified by the discovery. Sarah stood in the hallway, watching the organized chaos of the investigation, when her phone rang. It was Dr. Patricia Edmonds, a colleague from the university's history department who specialized in women's studies and 19th century social history. "Sarah, I heard about your discovery. This is extraordinary, potentially the most significant find related to women's resistance movements in the post-Civil War South. We need to preserve those journals, get them properly analyzed. The historical implications are enormous. The police have them as evidence right now," Sarah explained. "But Pat, it's not just a historical find. There are potentially bodies down there. This is an active crime scene." 150 years later? "Sarah, those women were heroes. They protected the vulnerable at great personal risk. Whatever they did was in defense of themselves and others." Sarah wasn't so sure. As she had read more of the journals while waiting for police, she had found entries that troubled her. One from Clara, dated 1876, had been particularly disturbing. "The work has changed us, I fear. What began as necessity has become something else. When Thomas came yesterday with his suspicions, his threats to expose us, Edith did not hesitate. There was no immediate danger, no self-defense to justify our actions. But we could not let him destroy what we have built." Margaret cried for days. "She is too soft for this work, too young still to understand that sometimes evil must be met with greater evil to protect a greater good. But I wonder, late at night when sleep will not come, if we have crossed a line we can never step back from." Sarah had photographed that entry but had not yet shared it with the police. It suggested that the killings had escalated beyond self-defense, that the sisters had begun to see themselves as judge, jury, and executioner. But was she obligated to share everything she had documented, or did she have a responsibility to these women whose story had been hidden for so long? Her ethical dilemma was interrupted by Marcus, who came rushing up from the cellar, his face flushed with excitement. "They've opened the sealed section. Sarah, you have to see this." Detective Holloway emerged from the trapdoor behind Marcus. "Actually, Dr. Mitchell, I think you should see this. We might need your expertise to understand what we found." Sarah followed them back down into the cellar, where the sealed section of wall had been carefully removed. Behind it was a small alcove, perhaps 4 feet deep, carved into the earth and reinforced with stone. Inside, propped against the back wall, was a skeleton, clearly female based on the pelvic structure, wearing the remnants of a dark dress, her skeletal hands still clutching a journal to her chest. "Based on the clothing and the position," Officer Valdez said quietly, "I'd say she was sealed in here alive. This isn't like the other graves. This was different." Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes as she stared at the remains. One of the sisters? But which one and why? She thought about the census records, Edith and Margaret disappearing after 1873, only Clara remaining. Had Clara killed her own sisters? Or had something else happened? The journal clutched by the skeleton was leather-bound like the others but in better condition due to the sealed environment. Detective Holloway carefully photographed everything before gently removing the journal from the bony fingers. He handed it to Sarah, who had donned latex gloves. The first entry made her gasp audibly. "My name is Edith Callahan, and if you are reading this, it means I am dead and you have found my tomb. I write this on October 14, 1873, knowing that I will not see another dawn. My sister Clara has decided that I have become a liability to our work. She is not wrong. I have lost the stomach for what we do here. The killing, justified at first, has consumed her. Margaret still follows Clara blindly, too young and too frightened to question. But I can no longer participate in this horror." Sarah continued reading aloud, her voice trembling. "Thomas Rutherford came to paint our portrait yesterday, commissioned by Clara to mark our commitment to each other and to the work. But Thomas is an observant man, and he saw too much. He noticed the cellar door, asked questions about the women who visit our home and never leave the same way they came. I saw Clara's expression change, saw her make the decision. After he finished the portrait, she invited him to stay for supper. He never left." "So the painter was one of the victims?" Detective Holloway said. "Did he know what was going to happen? Is that why he included the cellar door in the portrait?" Sarah shook her head. "I think he suspected something was wrong and he left a clue, the door, the shadowy figure in the background. He was documenting what he had discovered in the only way he could." She continued reading Edith's final testament. "When I objected to killing Thomas, when I said we could not murder an innocent man simply for his suspicions, Clara told me I had lost sight of our mission. She said that our work was too important to be endangered by my weakness. But I saw the truth in her eyes. She has come to enjoy it. The power of holding life and death in her hands. The righteousness of her own judgment. She has become the very thing we swore to fight against. A tyrant who kills with impunity." The entry went on for several more pages, describing how Clara had drugged Edith's evening tea, how she had woken to find herself being carried down to the cellar, how Margaret had cried but done nothing to stop it. The final words were barely legible, written in a shaking hand. "She is sealing the wall now. Margaret is weeping. Clara's face is stone. I can hear the mortar being applied, stone by stone, and I know that no one will ever hear my screams. To whoever finds this, know that we were not heroes. We were broken women who broke further under the weight of our choices. Judge us as you will, but remember that the world that created us offered no other path. I die here, in this darkness, and I pray that God has mercy on us all." Silence filled the cellar as Sarah finished reading. Even the hardened police officers seemed shaken by the testimony. This was not a simple story of heroic resistance or tragic self-defense. It was a complicated tale of trauma, violence, revenge, and ultimately, madness. Officer Valdez began the careful process of documenting and removing Edith's remains while Sarah carefully bagged the journal as evidence. The forensic team would spend days processing the cellar, exhuming and analyzing the other bodies, trying to identify victims and understand the full scope of what had happened in this house. As Sarah and Marcus were finally allowed to leave that evening, Detective Holloway pulled her aside. "Dr. Mitchell, I know this isn't easy, but we're going to need you to go through all the documents you found, create a comprehensive timeline. The DA wants to know if there are any living descendants who should be notified, any families of victims who deserve closure." Sarah nodded, exhausted but knowing her work was far from over. As she drove home through the darkening streets of Asheville, she couldn't stop thinking about Edith Callahan, sealed alive in that stone tomb, writing her final words by candlelight while her sister built her grave around her. 3 weeks after the discovery of the cellar, Sarah sat in a conference room at the university, surrounded by documents, journals, photographs, and a whiteboard covered in her carefully constructed timeline. The forensic analysis had been completed, the bodies identified where possible, and now it was time to piece together the full story of the Callahan sisters and their house of secrets. The remains found in the sealed alcove had been confirmed as Edith Callahan, dead at the age of 19. The other 4 bodies buried in the cellar floor had been identified through dental records and personal effects. Thomas Rutherford, the portrait painter, aged 32, James Morrison, husband of one of the women the sisters had helped, aged 45, Robert Blackwell, a local businessman who had threatened to expose the sisters' operation, aged 38, and most disturbingly, Margaret Callahan herself, the youngest sister, aged 17. It was Margaret's presence among the dead that had shocked everyone, including Sarah. She had been found in a shallow grave, her skull showing evidence of blunt force trauma. The autopsy results suggested she had been killed shortly after Edith's death, possibly within days. Sarah had found the explanation in Clara's final journal, dated November 1873. Margaret could not live with what we had done to Edith. She threatened to go to the authorities, to confess everything. I tried to reason with her, to make her understand that our work was too important, that we had saved dozens of women from lives of brutality and degradation. But she was hysterical, inconsolable. In the struggle that followed, she struck her head. It was an accident, truly, but the result is the same. Now I am alone in this house with my ghosts and my purpose. Clara Callahan had lived in the mansion for another 15 years, continuing her work of helping abused women escape their circumstances. But according to the records Sarah had uncovered, she never killed anyone else. The cellar remained sealed, a tomb for her sisters and the men she had judged worthy of death. She had been found dead in 1888 at the age of 41, apparently from natural causes, though the exact details were unclear. Sarah had traced the history of the house after Clara's death. It had been sold to a family named Whitmore in 1889, who had lived there unaware of the cellar and its grim contents. The house had passed through several owners over the decades, each generation never suspecting what lay beneath the parlor floor. Dr. Patricia Edmonds entered the conference room carrying 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of Sarah. "You look exhausted. How much longer do you plan to work on this?" "Until I understand it," Sarah replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "I keep trying to figure out who these women really were. Were they victims who became victimizers? Vigilantes dispensing their own justice? Or something more complex?" Patricia sat down, studying the photographs of the 3 sisters that Sarah had arranged on the table. "I think they were traumatized women trying to survive in a world that offered them no legal protection or recourse. The fact that they helped other women suggests genuine compassion. But trauma breaks people in different ways, and for Clara, it seems to have broken something fundamental." Sarah picked up one of Edith's earlier journals, from before the killings began. She read aloud, "A woman came today with burns on her arms and terror in her eyes. Her husband had held her hands to the stove to teach her obedience. We gave her shelter, food, hope. Clara arranged papers that would allow her to travel to California under a new name. When she left 3 days later, she wept with gratitude. This is why we do what we do. This is what gives our lives meaning." "They started with good intentions," Sarah continued. "Genuine desire to help. But somewhere along the way, the violence they witnessed and the violence they inflicted changed them. Clara especially. She began to see herself as above the law, dispensing justice as she saw fit. Marcus entered the room, carrying a stack of newspaper articles he had collected from the 1870s and 1880s. I found something interesting. There are at least 12 documented cases of women who disappeared from abusive situations in western North Carolina between 1870 and 1885, all last seen in the Asheville area. I cross-referenced them with records in other states, California, Oregon, Missouri. I found 8 of them living under new names, building new lives. The Callahan sisters' network was extensive and, for the most part, successful. So they did save lives, Patricia said. That has to count for something. But they also took lives, Sarah countered, and not always in immediate self-defense. Thomas Rutherford posed no physical threat. Robert Blackwell could have been dealt with legally. And Edith was Clara's own sister, and she was murdered simply for wanting to stop the killing. The debate raged for hours, with no clear resolution. The more Sarah learned about the Callahan sisters, the more she realized that their story resisted simple categorization. They existed in a moral gray area that made people deeply uncomfortable. A knock on the door interrupted their discussion. Detective Holloway entered, followed by an elderly woman Sarah didn't recognize. The woman was perhaps 75, well-dressed, with sharp eyes that took in the room with evident curiosity. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Helen Morrison," Detective Holloway said. "She contacted us after the story about the cellar hit the news." "Helen, why don't you tell Dr. Mitchell what you told me?" Sarah descended the stone steps one last time, standing in the empty cellar. The shelves were gone, the journals removed to climate-controlled archives, the graves filled in with the bodies removed for proper burial. But the space itself remained, a testament to what had happened here. On the wall where Edith had been entombed, someone had carved a memorial, probably one of the forensic team, though no one admitted to it. It was simple: Edith Callahan, 1854 to 1873. She tried to stop it. Sarah stood in the darkness, listening to the silence, and finally understood something important. The Callahan sisters' story wasn't about heroism or villainy. It was about how trauma perpetuates itself, how victims can become victimizers, how the best intentions can lead to terrible ends. It was about the complexity of human nature and the impossibility of simple moral judgments when dealing with extreme circumstances. She climbed back up the stone steps, emerging into the afternoon light. The demolition crew would arrive tomorrow, and this house with all its secrets would be reduced to rubble and memory. But the story would endure, preserved in journals and photographs, in the exhibit at the museum, and in the continued debates about justice, trauma, and the choices people make when offered no good options. As Sarah walked out of the Whitmore estate for the last time, she looked back at the house, this beautiful, terrible place that had been both sanctuary and tomb, both refuge and prison. The afternoon sun caught the windows, making them gleam like watchful eyes, and Sarah thought about the portrait of 3 young women that had looked so innocent until you knew what lay beneath their feet. The house would be gone soon, but its ghosts would linger in the stories told about it, in the descendants who now knew the truth about their ancestors, and in the ongoing conversation about how we judge the actions of desperate people in desperate times. The 1873 portrait of the Appalachian sisters had looked innocent enough, just 3 young women in their formal parlor. But now everyone knew about the cellar below them, and nothing about their story would ever seem innocent again. The truth, as Sarah had learned, was far more complicated than any simple portrait could ever convey. Sometimes the darkness we bury beneath the surface is the most honest thing about us, and sometimes the secrets we keep are the only way we know how to survive. The Callahan sisters had been both victims and villains, saviors and killers, and the portrait that had preserved their image for over a century would forever remind us that human beings are capable of both extraordinary compassion and terrible cruelty, often at the same time, often for reasons that make perfect sense within their own desperate contexts. That was the true story beneath the floorboards, and it was a story that would continue to haunt everyone who heard it, just as it had haunted that house for 150 years.